Hello, my friends. Welcome to Deep Six, the Deep State. Today we're going to talk about a lot of topics. But the theme is that the dossier is emerging as the major issue in the Trump investigation. That's a big win for us. It means that instead of everybody focusing on this crazy issue of collusion, they're now focusing on the issue of where did this dossier come from, fell out of the sky, and who wrote it, and who paid for it, and so on. These topics are all explained in my book, Rogue Spooks. Please get a copy of it and read it if you want to understand what's going on here. And this playbook is going to be around for another year or so. And increasingly, it's turning against the investigators. I've always believed that the solution when you're under attack in politics is two parts. Part one is deny the allegation, and part two is shoot the alligator. And that's what we're up to now, shooting the alligator. The other day there was an interview of Sally Yates, who is was the Deputy Attorney General under Obama, and she's the one who would not defend the government's opposition to the Defense of Marriage Act. In other words, she would not oppose the Defense of Marriage Act, which was she was supposed to do in her position as Deputy Attorney General. And Trump fired her, like in the first few days of her tenure in office. Or it may have been some other controversy, I forget what it was. But it was right back in January when Trump took office. So she's about as hardened a partisan of the Clintons and of the anti-Trump resistance as you're likely to find. In her interview with Vanity Fair, she works to cool expectations that Mueller will be able to get Trump, that he'll be able to impeach him. And it's the first time we've seen a little bit of doubt coming from the other side. And if you follow what I'm about to say in this broadcast, you'll see the texture of that doubt asserting itself throughout. Yates said, quote, "I know a lot of people are sort of putting all their hopes into Bob Mueller," meaning the anti-Trump people. "And I've got tremendous confidence in Bob Mueller. But the fact of the matter is, he's going to determine whether there's proof beyond a reasonable doubt that felonies were committed, that crimes were committed, that can be used for prosecution or impeachment. He may not decide that there is an offense to be charged or referred to the House of Representatives for impeachment. May not decide. And I respect that. And I think people who are on one side of the fence should respect that also, meaning the anti-Trump partisans who are panting for blood. The fact of the matter is that nobody's found it. I always say this is like the Loch Ness Monster. Nobody's seen it, but everybody's sure it's there. And this phantom of collusion has the whole Democratic Party in its thrall, but nobody's seen it. There's no evidence of it. The station chief of the CIA under Obama in Moscow retired and said that there was no evidence that he saw of any collusion. And with all the leads and conversations and meetings that everybody's all crazy about, none of them produced any evidence of any collusion or attempted collusion. Now, and the standard that Mueller would have to meet is pretty damn high, beyond a reasonable doubt. That's for a jury conviction, and for impeachment, it's at least that and probably a little bit more to persuade the two-thirds majority you'll need to oust a president. So this is the first time we've seen the other side blink. Now, the Intelligence Committee itself in the Senate, headed by Burr from North Carolina and Patty Murray from Washington, has said that they are hitting a wall, that's their word, in their investigation of the dossier. They said that they hit a wall. The committee cannot really decide the credibility of the dossier without considering things like who paid for it, who are your sources, and your sub-sources. That's a statement by Burr, the chairman of the committee. So stonewalling is working. And the fact that Christopher Steele refuses to testify, he's a British subject and we can't make him testify, that that Simpson, the head of Fusion, who's an American who did testify, but refuses to turn over documents. He sent a raft of news clippings when asked for a document subpoena for the involvement of Fusion and how it got the money and what it paid for and who it paid and all of that. That was an unofficial request from the committee. Now they're going to issue a subpoena, and he'll have to comply with that. But we're a ways away from that now, and they're complaining that they've hit a wall. Now, in the meantime, the FBI, which was investigating the dossier and has been investigating it for a year and a half now, finally turned over all the documents about the dossier to Mueller. And they said, this is your problem. We're not going to mess with it anymore. And Mueller now has the task of investigating the dossier and deciding whether it's real or not, which it obviously is not. I mean, it couldn't be more obvious. You read our book and you see it. The whole story is based on the idea that Mike Cohn, Trump's lawyer, flew from New York to Prague and back and forth, all during the summer of 2016 to negotiate this collusion. And the passport shows he never left the United States in that period. Or he did, but a pleasure trip to Italy. And that he's never been in Prague or in the Czech Republic. And then it says that this guy was the one that hacked the Democratic computer, and it turns out he's doing 20 years in the archipelago in the Gulag for molesting a child, and that he didn't have access to a computer or even a telephone where he was located. And it says that these prostitutes peed on the bed in front of Trump and all kinds of crazy stuff like that. So Mueller now has the unenviable task of figuring this stuff out. But it all may come down to one factor, one simple factor: the courage of Paul Manafort. And when we come back, I'll let you know how that plays out and what the likely result will be. This whole investigation may boil down to a mano-a-mano match between Andrew Weissman on the one hand and Paul Manafort on the other. In the left corner, wearing the black trunks, is Andrew Weissman. He was in the fraud division of the Justice Department, and he led the prosecution of Enron. And his prosecution was so fierce, so ferocious, and crossed so many lines that even after he got a conviction, the appellate court threw out the conviction for prosecutorial misconduct. Oops, a $2 billion verdict down the sink. He has now been hired by Mueller to lead this prosecution. There's a woman named Sidney Powell who wrote a book called Licensed to Lie, which is about Andrew Weissman and his role in the Enron hearings. You might want to pick that up. It's a great book, Licensed to Lie. And she says that he works around psychologically intimidating and rattling and terrifying the people he's prosecuting. That's his M.O., and that he often gets them to say things that are not true, that say things they don't know are true, or that they know not to be true, in order to escape prosecution. And she says that that's the tactic he's going to use against Manafort, and it's the tactic he's been using. First of all, she cites the fact that, she says Weissman will want to maximize the trauma to Manafort's family. And she cites the fact of the pre-dawn raid on his house, where they came in before dawn and they stayed almost all day, ripping the house apart, getting documents, which are basically irrelevant. And the fact that it was a pre-dawn raid implied that he was going somewhere and that they needed to grab him. In fact, he was going to testify the next day, and did, before the Senate committee, so he wasn't going anywhere. This was just a shock and awe tactic to intimidate Manafort. And when they did this search, they told the media that Manafort would be indicted, and they told Manafort the same thing. They never do that. That's very unusual before an indictment is handing down, to predict one. And They summoned Manafort's former attorney, his current spokesman, to testify before the grand jury. That's also an intimidation tactic. That tells the guy who's giving you advice on how to survive this process is now compromised himself and doesn't know if he can think freely or act freely because he's in the crosshairs himself of the prosecutor. So that's a really strong intimidation tactic. And if that isn't enough to rattle Mr. Manafort, news reports citing confidential sources say he's sure to be indicted. And Sidney Powell, who wrote this book, License to Lie, says Manafort would be looking at several counts to begin with. If he doesn't cooperate, in response to that, they'll indict him for many more counts, which will ratchet up his cost of defense significantly, and he'll be looking at a lifetime in prison. Well, that's pretty daunting. That's a hell of a thing to be confronted with. But people who know Manafort don't think he's necessarily going to cave very easily.
Dick, we have a question from Carol Johnson. She wants to know, how long can they allow Mueller to go on with this witch hunt?
Forever. No time limits, no budget limits, no need for reauthorization. Forever is the answer to your question, unfortunately. But people who know Mr. Manafort have a counter narrative. They wonder why Mr. Mueller and his staff of 20 prosecutors had the FBI conduct the shock and awe pre-dawn search raid. They suggest that the trail to finding Russia-Trump collusion has become so cold that Mr. Mueller's game of hardball, led by Mr. Weissman, is a last-ditch effort to scare Manafort into becoming a prosecution witness. Now, this is from anonymous sources in a news story, and I suspect that probably Manafort and his attorney are the anonymous sources. So when they say there's a contrary view, we're probably getting what Manafort's thinking, even though he can't officially say that. They suggest that the trail, that Weissman is a last-ditch effort to scare Manafort into cooperating. Associates say Mr. Manafort is not a cooperating witness for one clear reason. He has nothing to reveal, and he's witnessed no illegal collusion. Mr. Manafort reportedly believes his personal consulting business of big bucks for advertising foreign politicians did nothing corrupt and did not violate the law, and that his tax returns are clean. So we're getting Manafort's point of view there. And that's essentially what this boils down to, a game of chicken. Now, I believe that in a game of chicken of this sort, if there was something there, if Manafort were in fact hiding something or had evidence of collusion, then I think you could probably force it out of him by these tactics. But without that, Manafort knowing in effect that he's innocent, that there's nothing there, I think that he'll tough it out and not become a prosecution witness. And the fact that everything is aimed at this one guy shows the vulnerability of the special prosecutor's case. It shows he doesn't have anything else. And this is kind of a last-minute, last-ditch attempt to make these charges stick.
Dick, Linda Wissheim wants to know, is it possible that Comey paid to have the dossier made?
Yes. It's possible that the FBI paid. We know that the FBI offered Steele $50,000 in October, the month before the election, to substantiate and validate the accusations he made in the dossier. And that Steele said he couldn't do it because these were anonymous sources, and therefore he never got paid the $50,000. We do know that the FBI offered, and we believe that Steele accepted, to have his expenses paid by the FBI during this period. We also surmise that Steele had been on the FBI payroll years before when they were investigating the FIFA scandal about international soccer, where countries were accused of bribing the FIFA authorities to get the final World Cup matches in their country. And the FBI investigated that, and Steele was part of that investigation, probably working for the FBI. We also know that he filed reports on Russia and Ukraine throughout the 1990s and the early years of this century to the FBI, which raises the possibility that he was paid then. Now, the FBI is stonewalling and refuses to release any information on its financial relationship with Steele. So yeah, there's a very good chance that he was paid, and that the FBI wrote this whole dossier. That's what they're all trying to cover up. They can't possibly let a situation come out where it turns out that the U.S. government was pushing false, defamatory, derogatory, outlandish, and unsubstantiated allegations against a presidential candidate.
Dick, Matthew James wants to know, instead of firing Mueller, can they just cut off funding?
They could. Legally they could, but politically they couldn't. The Congress would never permit that. They have to maintain the facade of this investigation. They have to let it go to its conclusion. They have to let Mueller do his thing. And if it dries up for lack of evidence, which it looks like it very well might, well, then that's great. But otherwise, or if he comes up with some weird way of going after him, saying that 30 years ago Trump sold some apartments to some Russian mob types, and that's evidence that he's involved with them. If it's something like that, then they can overlook it. But there's no procedural way to stop him in that way.
And Thomas Hillebrand wants to know, I do agree with banning bump stocks. Do you think they can get a clean passage on that?
Yeah, they can, but I'll talk about that a little bit later on. Now, when I come back, there is some fascinating evidence that the Democratic Party is finally beginning to realize the importance of the immigration issue. Hi. You know, we've all talked about the immigration issue, and I look at it usually as a statistical matter. How many people are coming over illegally? What's the impact on the job market? Are they taking jobs away from Americans? And all of that stuff. But Stanley Greenberg, who is a mortal enemy of mine, who was Bill Clinton's pollster before I replaced him in the White House, and he just did a very interesting study. Where he's a Democrat, liberal, very. And he did focus groups in Wisconsin and Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, the states that Hillary lost, that she didn't expect to understand why that happened. And he published the results of the focus group, and they are fascinating. I'm going to read you 3 quotes from people in the focus group. Now, these aren't my opinions or Stanley's, but they are the opinions of the people who were interviewed in the focus group. One person said, I went and finally signed up for Medicaid, and I'm standing in the damn welfare office, and I'm looking around at all of these people that can't even say hello to me in English. But they're all there with appointments for their workers, which means they have the health care, they have the food stamps. If you can come from somewhere else, why can't we get all of that? And the point that Stanley makes, and this article makes, it's in Reuters, I think, is that many of these immigrants settled in sparsely populated areas in the rural parts of these states. They didn't just go to Detroit or to Columbus or Cleveland or Madison or Milwaukee and blend in with a heavily integrated urban population. Many, many of them went into completely rural areas. In fact, they may have worked on farms, and therefore they wanted to live in rural areas, and really changed the demographics of the region, and changed it in a way where people really had their faces pushed into it. Another person said, my grandson's school, I went to as a child, and there's hardly any, I'll just say American families there now. It's mostly Middle Eastern, and people all standing outside waiting for their kid to pick them up at the end of the day. And nobody's speaking English. Everybody's speaking other languages, which there's nothing wrong with other languages. Okay, you can see it again. This feeling that they have polluted the country, and that this is no longer the nation that they grew up in and that they know. Third person. And you know what? Like where I'm working at Kroger, how many Spanish people I wait on? the universal language. I don't care. I don't care if you smile. Hello, I don't care what country you're from. But some of these people act like they can't do that, even if it's like, you know what, you're in America. Get with either you can learn to say hello, goodbye, and thank you in your own language. This is America. So you can see in that the frustration that we're talking about, the culture shock. And of course this presentation is just based on episodic views of people's impressions as they live. But in fact, it represents a very real competition for jobs at the bottom end of the ladder. And yesterday I discussed a terrible Republican proposal, which is to allow 1 million guest workers to come into the United States and have them do farm work, and then when the work is finished, send them back to Mexico. And don't put them on a path to citizenship, and don't give them benefits, pay the minimum wage. A terrible idea, because it means that the farm employers are not going to pay a decent wage to these people. They're not going to be able to attract American workers, and they're going to be dependent on illegal immigrants, whether guest workers or people who come here illegally. The point is that we need to change the whole system. We need to pay more, probably, for our food and our vegetables. We need to understand that these are human beings who are picking this stuff, and that we've got to give them a fair shake. And when you do that, the Americans are very willing to take those jobs. I gave you the stats yesterday. 75% of the people involved in agriculture or landscaping in the United States are American-born. 2/3 of the construction workers are American-born. Almost 2/3 of the hospitality workers at hotels and restaurants and so on are American-born. A majority of the nannies and the maids and the housekeepers are American-born. So, don't give me this stuff that Americans don't want those jobs. They don't want those jobs for dirt cheap wages where they have to work like they do in China. They don't want that. But offer them decent wages, and they'll be right there taking these jobs. It's not that they consider the work undignified. And these focus groups really give you a sense of how people feel about that. Remember what Ted Cruz said in one of the debates? If these were doctors and lawyers and accountants and advertising executives wading across the Rio Grande to enter the United States illegally, we would be stopping them like crazy because they would take jobs away from rich people in the United States. But they're not. They're only taking them away from poor people. And the system doesn't give a damn about that.
Dick, James Clausen says, could the phony dossier force Mueller to look towards the Democrats?
Yeah, of course it will. That's the whole point. And not even the Democrats, the government, the FBI, the CIA. This dossier was very, very specific. Source A, who is a housekeeper in the hotel, says blah, blah, blah. And it's hard to imagine a private individual putting something like that together. It would have to be a government agency. And what government? Ukraine isn't going to do it. Russia, it's against their interest to do it. Could be Britain, could be the United States. But either way, this is a scandal that would blow Washington sky high. Now, when we come back, I'd like to talk to you about the Iran deal and give you a perspective on it that I think is really important. In the Iran deal, we have the right to inspect Iran to make sure they're holding up their end of the deal. But the treaty says that we can only inspect sites where Iran has agreed to allow inspection, no other sites. So they'll say, you can look here and there, but for God's sakes, don't look under the green tent. And that guarantee, as weak as that is only in an additional protocol added to the agreement after signing. And Iran's agreement to accept the additional protocol was voluntary, and it can exit it at any time without this being considered a violation of the agreement. So it doesn't even have to have these inspections. It can waive all inspections and not have any inspections and still be complying with the agreement. All of this has compromised the International Atomic Energy Agency's, which is a good group, ability to effectively police Iranian compliance with the deal. Because if IAEA decides that Iran is not granting inspections where it should, its recourse is it goes back to the original signatories of the agreement other than Iran: Russia, China, the United States, Britain, France, Germany, and the European Union. And those 7 countries discuss what to do. And Russia and China have a veto. So it's basically a political process that they'd have to go through to cite a failure for inspection. So effectively, they have no power to control, to command anything. They also are not, Iran is not allowing us to question their nuclear scientists. They are not allowing our scientists and inspectors to visit the Parchin nuclear site, but instead they gave IAEA soil samples that they say are from parchment, absolutely. And you can test them for anything you want. Oh, we swear it is. We swear this is from the original garment that Jesus wore on the way to the cross. We swear. I mean, come on. There's the issue of the oversight of 8.5 tons of Iran's uranium, which was handed over to Russia. We don't know what's happened with those. And Iran's heavy water has been stored in Oman, which is really a political satellite of Iran. Now, it's very likely that President Trump is going to certify this week or next week that Iran is not in compliance with the deal, and that will spark an entire new wave of controversy. And I want to show you how weak the deal is, so that even they can't even comply with that. And it's just a shocking situation.
Dick, Michelle Pokipala asks, why hasn't Trump named a special prosecutor to go after Mueller, Comey, Hillary, Lynch, etc.?
Well, he can't prosecute Mueller like that. Not a government, not a public official. But he could prosecute the others, and he could do that, and Sessions could do that. But, you know, I think when you look at this, at first he didn't because he was afraid to, because he thought the backlash would be horrible. And I think the Republicans in the Senate told him that. But now I think that he feels this investigation is just running out of fuel. You know, you have a raging forest fire going completely crazy, out of control, threatening to devour thousands and tens of thousands of acres of forest land, and then it begins to run out of fuel, and it begins to die down. And suddenly you don't have to worry about it that much. It may just burn itself out. And I think that might be what's going to happen here.
Well, Andrew Schiappone wants to know, is it possible for Mueller to be charged with unethical practices, or is there no end to his leash?
It is possible for any lawyer, but don't count on it. He's highly respected. The establishment likes him. And ultimately, the establishment trusts he's going to do a fair job. That's why that's why Sally Yates said what I said, which is that he may come up with no indictment, with no bill, because the evidence just doesn't lead him in that direction.
And Deborah Ann wants to know, was Mueller ever really hired, or was he appointed?
Appointed by Rod Rosenstein, who was the Deputy Attorney General, who made the appointment in the place of Sessions, who recused himself. Now, there's good progress coming along, finally, in building the border wall with Mexico. The House Homeland Security Committee just voted for a $10 billion appropriation to begin further construction on the wall. And that's the beginning of a process here. Now, what's likely to happen is that when DACA comes up for reauthorization, and the issue is, are we going to try to throw these dreamer kids out of the country, I think there may well be an accommodation about the wall. The Democrats say Trump promised it wouldn't happen, but I don't think he can count on that. I don't think either he didn't promise it or he's not going to keep it. I think that there may be an accommodation that includes that. In any case, most likely the Republicans will get the passage of the RAISE Act, R-A-I-S-E, raise as in raise wages, which is to reform the legal immigration system. Number one, to cut the number of immigrants in half, from 1 million a year to 500,000. Number two, to make the immigration based on a merit system of whether they can earn a living and how much they can contribute to our economy. And number three, to end the process of anchor babies, where you come into the country just simply because a member of your family is here already. Now, there is a controversy, obviously, about the gun bump stocks, which the shooter used in Las Vegas. And I'll talk about that in a minute when we come back. Hi. Now here I'm a novice. I'm not a gun person. I don't even own a gun. But I do read the papers a lot, and I'm a strong believer, and always have been, the Second Amendment to the Constitution was the Second Amendment, so it could be used to enforce the First Amendment against a tyrannical government. Apparently, there's something called a gun stock, which you can fit on a rifle, on a semi-automatic rifle, and make it into sort of a machine gun. The stuff that I've read indicates that it's really more of a thrill. It's more something people do because they can then, for a few seconds, shoot like it's a machine gun and have that feeling. But that it's very wobbly, aim is very difficult, accurate aim is impossible, and that it is not the sustained burst that you get from a machine gun. Now, machine guns are illegal in the United States and always have been, and you can't own one. But this is something that makes a semi-automatic rifle into what could be considered a machine gun. The difference, as I understand it, is a semi-automatic is you pull the trigger and you get a shot. An automatic is you pull the trigger and you get a repeated series of shots, like from a machine gun. And the NRA has endorsed banning gun stocks, and the chairman of the committee in charge of it, Ron Johnson, senator from Wisconsin, has also endorsed the bill. He's a Republican. So it looks like that's going to pass. And that's good. That sounds like a common sense and very interesting solution. Now, another bill that's moving through Congress is driverless cars. Now, you don't need a bill to allow them, and you don't need a bill to subsidize them. They're coming. But there is a lot of regulation in the federal government on what has to be in a car. The steering wheel, the accelerator, the brake, all kinds of stuff that's based on a manually driven car. So they need to change that language so that it can accommodate a driverless car. And there's a bill that does that, that has just been reported out of the Senate committee, and probably is going to pass. And probably that authorizes these additional procedures to be built into up to 80,000 vehicles over a 3-year period for each car manufacturer. And there are 5 or 6 of them in the United States, including foreign ones. So you're talking about probably 500,000 vehicles. And the total number of vehicle sales in the United States, I believe, is less than 2 million each year. So that's a very significant addition to the fleet. Clearly, driverless cars are coming very soon. And along with them, gasless cars are coming. Many car companies have announced that starting in 2020, they will not produce cars that require gasoline. And those kinds of electric cars instead. And those kinds of changes are coming. They're going to totally transform our transportation system in the country. And, by the way, lead to the unemployment of a great many people who work in that industry. Truck drivers, limos, taxis, buses, and just private drivers and the whole industry about them.
Dick, we have some questions that are a little off topic, but Annette Ishmael wants to know, are you and Eileen working on another book together?
No, not now, not yet. Our marriage can only take 1 a year. I always said I'm like a teenage mother. I give birth to 1 a year. But yeah, no, we're not. But thanks for asking.
And Brandon Altas, he's very curious. He wants to know what you know about the relationship between Roger Clinton Jr. and Bill and Hillary.
Well, Roger, was Bill's younger brother, and he kind of was the ne'er-do-well in the family, and always was on drugs, and using cocaine and all kinds of stuff like that. There was a very poignant moment when Governor Bill Clinton was notified that Roger had been arrested for drugs in Arkansas by the Arkansas State Police. And Governor Clinton told me at that point that he was very conflicted, because he said if Roger had to go to jail in Arkansas, he'd be locked up with people who want the governor to pardon them, or people who might have it in for Clinton for not pardoning them, and that he was worried about retaliation against his brother. And it took a lot for him not to tell his brother that he was being set up by the police in a phony drug bust, and that he would be arrested if he went ahead with that. And he didn't tell his mother, he didn't tell Roger, and Roger went ahead with the deal, and he was arrested, was convicted, and did time in the Arkansas prison system. Bill has always felt guilty about that, and has done a lot to help Roger. First of all, he pardoned 2 or 3 people that were paying Roger Clinton to get a presidential pardon. And when he was in Haiti and basically controlling the Haiti recovery, Bill Clinton made sure that Roger Clinton got on the board of a gold mining company that got a contract to mine gold in Haiti, even though it had no prior experience. And Roger, of course, knew nothing about it. So it's a very suspect relationship with a great deal of corruption. Now, there is a very interesting contention that I've been reading. Everybody says that we need better mental health measures to stop things like the Columbine shooting or the Newton massacre or the Vegas shooting and so on. But a lot of doctors and a lot of scientists are saying, hey, wait a minute, don't blame mental illness for all of this. A great many of these shooters are not mentally ill, and they're motivated by a lot of other things, but they're not schizophrenic. Eric Paddock, Stephen's brother, Stephen is the shooter, said that he's never had any history of mental illness or psychiatric care. The scientists say that people that are shooters blame the outside world for their problems. Mass murderers would likely resist therapies that ask them to look inside themselves or to change their behavior. But that very little violence is actually caused by mentally ill people. A study of convicted murderers in Indiana found that just 18% had a serious mental illness diagnosis. If we were able to magically cure schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and major depression, that would be wonderful, said Jeffrey Swanson from Duke University. But overall violence would go down by only about 4%. One review paper published in 2014 found that, quote, a history of childhood abuse, binge drinking, and male gender are all linked to serious violence. Mental illness was not, unless the person was also a drug addict. According to the National Center for Health Statistics, fewer than 5% of the 120,000 gun-related killings in the United States in the decade between 01 and 10 were perpetrated by people diagnosed with a mental illness. And a database of indiscriminate mass shootings found that only 15% of the assailants had a psychotic disorder, and 11% were paranoid schizophrenics. So that's sobering data. And it leads one to the conclusion that just as you can't control the guns, you can't control the people. But you can protect the potential victims with metal detectors and screening and all of the procedures that we effectively use now to stop violence in sports stadiums or in airplanes. And if we apply that to movie theaters and auditoriums and concerts and any kind of mass assemblage, we can be very effective in stopping that sort of horrible behavior.
We have a question from Donald Cole. He wants to know, can you speak directly with Trump? A lot of people want to know that.
I refuse to answer that question on the grounds that I'm not allowed to.
And Shirley Gaunt Lindley says, do you think President...
Let me just mention that
sure.
Trump was, my father was Donald Trump's lawyer. And my father was the top real estate lawyer in New York, and Trump was his best client. and he worked for Trump's father, and then he worked for Trump. Donald once told me that my father was the best lawyer he ever had, and said that he was my lawyer on Trump Tower, which was the only project where I really needed a lawyer, and he did a great job. He then said, he wasn't like you at all. Your father was non-political, not like you. And I remember Donald from the time I was in my early 20s when he came over for dinner with his father. So I've known Trump for a very long time and very well.
Well, Nancy Long wants to know, what is the status of the parents of the Dreamers kids?
Right now, the status of the parents of the Dreamers, as of this minute, is that they are here illegally and they will be deported, eligible for deportation, when the amnesty that has been declared by Donald Trump ends in about 5.5 months. At the time that the DACA was enacted by Obama, he gave amnesty to the children, but not to their parents. And the amnesty was not a legal amnesty. It didn't say you're not in violation of the law. It wasn't a pardon. What it was he said, we're going to get to you last. We're going to deal with everybody else we can, and then we'll get to your situation. And so we'll put you at the bottom of the pile. Now, of course, all of that is in flux. And it's most likely that the DACA solution will not include amnesty for the parents. These are now adult children, and they've lived in this country their whole lives. And there is no reason why the parents should get amnesty.
And I'm sorry, we have some more questions. Just lost my space. Oh,
It's okay. Yeah, I just have one other topic I want to talk about.
Sorry.
There is an increasing tendency on the part of Google and other electronic entities, including Facebook and YouTube and all of those companies, to use computers to censor their product. The workload is so vast. There are so many people saying so much over it that it's impossible for it to be done manually. And the risk is that they will come up with words that they consider, in their words, toxic, but are not. They're just legitimate objects of political expression. And the question is, can their programs differentiate between serious scholarship or casual conversation or inflammatory toxic material? Google has named a 4-person board to help it implement this program, which they call Perspective, and a step closer to our goal of helping to foster troll-free discussion online and filtering out the abusive comments that silence vulnerable voices. And the prospective partners are the New York Times, The Guardian, Wikipedia, and The Economist, all certified registered liberals. I don't know about Wikipedia, but the other 3 certainly are. So this is something to watch. Will online censorship take place based by computers who are given instructions that cannot differentiate between broadcasts of this sort and inflammatory broadcasts?
Steve Galante wants to know, why can't Hillary be banned from any political position due to her questionable background?
Well, the only way to ban someone is convict them of a felony, and that's a jury trial and an indictment and the whole bit. And nobody's done that with her. So she can't. And she is going to try to run again. I don't know if the party will nominate her. There's a lot of ill will there, but she's going to try. That's why she's doing this book tour. Well, thanks very much.
Oh,
and
we
have
we have the selfie of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. This is, the selfie is, Renee is encouraging people to hold up my book, Rogue Spooks, and she'll put them on this selfie page that we have. Where is the page?
It's on the main dickmorris.com page. If you go to the photos, the first one there, you'll see the picture to post your selfie, post it in there. And we actually have, I'm just going to show you, we have Andrew Humes, which I'm going to post on there, but I also, you won't be able to see it on the camera. And this is his dog, Winston Churchill Humes, with your book, so I'll be posting that.
So apparently Andrew and Winston Churchill Humes will be on the Facebook page. But I'll bet you that your dog doesn't bark like Winston. Thank you.
And tomorrow's Winston Churchill Day.
Yes.